Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Pocklington William Wilberforce 250. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name's Phil Gilbank. I'm chairman of the Pocklington and District Local History Group, and I was reading through some stuff 2 or 3 years ago, and it suddenly jumped off the page that William Wilberforce actually came to Pocklington in November 1771. What we're looking to do this evening is bring together elements of Pocklington Town, Pocklington Church and Pocklington School. And as I'm an old boy of the school and involved in the church and in the town, then I didn't really have much choice but to try and pull something together this evening. The focus isn't going to be on the incredible life of William Wilberforce. We will look at that, but if you want to know all about his life, there are any number of good biographies, or go on to Wikipedia. What we're looking to do this evening is see Pocklington through William Wilberforce's eyes, and also see how it influenced his later life, because it's quite clear that a lot of the values he adapted when he was here, he carried forward into adulthood. Like I say, he is an incredible figure. He was voted in a BBC poll as the greatest ever Yorkshireman in 2000. So we're going to look at William Wilberforce the boy, and then how he went on to be William Wilberforce the man. We need to bust a few myths and put things into context as well. I've talked about his biographies. A number of the biographies talk about how he was sent to Pocklington because of his family's fear that he was becoming a Methodist, and that he was sent to the rural seclusion of Pocklington. William Wilberforce was 9 years old when his father died, and he was sent to his uncle who lived in Wimbledon, and he was very, very happy there. But his uncle and aunt became evangelical Methodists, and that really worried his mother. Methodism wasn't a separate denomination as it is today. It was a movement from within the Church of England. John Wesley was an Anglican clergyman, but it was seen rather much as lower middle class and working class, and the Wilberforce family were very much middle and upper middle class, and so that was one of the things that really worried his mother. And his letters home, he was becoming more and more evangelical, and so he was hauled back to Hull and sent to Pocklington, which was a hotbed of Methodism. John Wesley visited Pocklington 18 times from the 1750s through into the 1780s. And so Pocklington was very active in William Wilberforce's 5 years here, from 1771 to 1776. There was already a Methodist meeting house in the town from the mid-1760s. And so he was being rescued from Methodism and sent to a place where it was very active. But he was sent to live with the headmaster of Pocklington School, the splendidly named Reverend Kingsman Basket. And Basket was obviously a clergyman and a headmaster, but he was very much a pragmatist. In addition to being headmaster of the school, he supplemented his income, and throughout he spent over 50 years here at Pocklington as headmaster of the school, and in that corner is his memorial on the wall. And he, in addition to being the headmaster, he supplemented his income because throughout that 50 years he was always the vicar of at least one parish and the curate of another. So when he was here, he was rector of Louth, he was vicar of a parish in Lincolnshire, and he was the curate of Givendale and at Everingham. So he worked in a way that helped him to help others. He had 3 sons, and 2 of them went into the church. He had 2 daughters, and both of them married clergymen. So the household that William Wilberforce grew up in his teenage years was a very religious household. A lot of his biographers talk about him being sent to the rural seclusion of Pocklington. Wimbledon was a village on the out of London in those times, so he came to Pocklington, which again was another rural setting. But rural seclusion gives the impression that it was quite a peaceful, urbane sort of place. I'm not going to denigrate Pocklington. One of my great passions is Pocklington history. But when Wilberforce was here, it was before the Industrial Revolution. So there were no major mill towns full of factories. The business of the country was done by cottage industry. And Pocklington was very much an agricultural place, and it was a place full of cottage industry. And so this idea of it being nice and peaceful isn't how Wilberforce will have seen it. The 2 main industries here were the malting of barley and brewing of beer, and the tanning of leather. And if anybody's ever been past a tannery, it smells horrible. And if you've been next to a brewery, then that had a bit of a different smell as well. So the Pocklington that Wilberforce roamed around in whiffed a bit. In addition, it was quite a noisy place as well. When he came here in 1771, enclosure had only just happened in Pocklington. Before that, the farmers had a few acres in that direction, and a few in that direction, and a few back over there. So all their farmsteads and farmyards were in the middle of town. They didn't have farms as we understand them today. That only came in the following century, where they started to build out in the middle of the landholding. So just over the road there were 6 farmsteads along George Street. And not only that, right next door to West Green, where the school was, what we know as West Green Park today, was the pinfold. It was the field where every Pocklington citizen could keep his cow. And most of them had a cow, and they would tether it there overnight and then walk it past the school in the morning and milk it round the back of the house. It was also the way in where we had a weekly market and 7 annual fairs. And some of those fairs were for cattle, and you'll see at the back there is a picture of Beast Fair Bridge a few years after Wilberforce left Pocklington. and it's called Beastfair Bridge, which is the mini roundabout just where the library is. The beck flowed open through Pocklington, and so Wilberforce's journey from Pocklington School to the church here, which he made many, many times, he had to cross Beastfair Bridge, and it's called Beastfair Bridge because that's where they used to sell the cattle. And so again, local farmers would bring in once a week their cattle from the villages and sell them in Pocklington. And then it was on a conveyor belt. They went to the local butchers, who often killed them at the side of the road. And we have many examples of butchers being fined for throwing waste in the beck or even digging holes in the road to bury it. And then they were skinned and went to the tannery. And so it was a very noisy place. The other side of the coin is it was quite a cosmopolitan place, even back in the 1770s. The local vicars from the villages all lived in Pocklington, and there was a library here and there was regular theatre. But what we have got is a contemporary description of what Pocklington was like, thanks to a guy called William Hickington. Hickington called himself the Pocklington poet. He hated living in Pocklington. He was from an old Pocklington family, goes back to Tudor times. His father went to Pocklington School and then up to Glasgow University and became the vicar of South Cave. And William Hickington grew up in one of his father's houses as a gentleman. He went to Cambridge, didn't seem to do a lot of work, but he was down on his luck and he had to come back to the family house in Pocklington and didn't like it. But he overlapped with William Wilberforce. So Hickington wrote poetry in the early 1770s describing how he saw Pocklington. And I'd said earlier, tonight we're combining school, church and town, and I'm going to ask the town crier of Pocklington, Jeff Sheasby, to read some extracts from William Hickington's poem.
Hickington, 1770. While you, my friends, your new-bought fields admire, and from Bellona's public ports retire, me, in low Pocklington, the fates confine, mid droves of bullocks and mid herds of swine, scenes ill-adapted to the muse's lyre, where fogs, full frequent, damp her mounting fire. Which way soe'er I turn my loathing eyes, large piles of dirt and heaps of garbage rise. Ensanguined kennels compass me around, and still I seem to tread on slaughtering ground. For here, so oft, the butcher lifts his knife, that scarce the generous cow can scape with life. Pent in the stalls, the ill-fated heifer lows, and boar's responsive grunt to grumbling sows. E'en harmless lambs in piteous plaining bleat, doomed to deck out some purse proud farmer's treat.
Oh dear. But it does get a bit better. I think that does exemplify, in very graphic terms, what Wilberforce had to do as he walked through the town. But Hickington goes on to talk about how he would get out of Pocklington as often as he could. And that's very pertinent to what we're doing this evening, because we know from Wilberforce's own writings that he loved going out into the countryside and learning and reciting poetry. And so I'll ask Jeff to read the second part of that same poem, where Hickington leaves the terrible place of Pocklington behind.
But soft, my muse, nor thus prolong thy lays. Forbear to men don what thou must dispraise. Already thou hast lain obscure too long. Rise then at once and raise a nobler song. How joys the bard, thus breathing purer air, to sweep the hills and urge the flying hare. And hearken, hearken, rings along the vale. Such are the joys that Huggett's fields afford. Oh, happy fields, thrice happy in your Lord. Sometimes to lonely Lounsborough I retire, and the still garden's empty walks admire. See where Wilton her fair fields displays. But restless fancy, ever on the wing of distant scenes, commands my muse Tazing. Then wafter winds to water's princely seat, or cover her in Killick's calm retreat, where peace and love perpetually reside, and all the virtues shine in all their pride. Oh, how has heaven enriched fair water's fields with all the heart can wish or nature yields, with crops luxuriant, to her meadows how glad, how shines her hills with silver fleeces clad.
I said that was pertinent to Wilberforce because he enjoyed going out of town and on country walks, and the places that Jeff described there would be the places that Wilberforce walked around, because again in 1771 we're talking of it being before the Pocklington Canal was built, and as well we're in what's called the medieval ice age. It started raining in 1320 and it didn't really stop till 1850. And so the climate and the countryside was much wetter than it is today. And indeed, one of Kingsman Baskett's predecessors at Pocklington School was Robert Robinson, and shows how the school wasn't necessarily on its own that lucrative a position, because Robinson was headmaster for 10 years, and then he gave up and he moved to an easier life, and I think he thought a more rewarding life, as rector of Harswell and curate of Seaton Ross. But when there was a visitation of his parish, he was asked if he lived in the parish, and he said, "Oh, no way, it's far too wet and unhealthy living out at Harswell or Seaton Ross." Because you had lots of Ings land. It was a marsh for a big part of the year. And so Robinson and several other local clergy all lived in town. He lived in Pocklington for 50 years and went out to Harswell once a week. And so it was in that direction that Wilberforce took his walks. And some of the places that Jeff mentioned, again, are very appropriate, because Wilberforce made lifelong friends with several of the local families, particularly the Penningtons at Water, but also the Andersons and then the Denisons at Killick-Percy, and also around further to Lounsborough. And they were people that he became friends early in life and at school with, and maintained those friendships for the rest of his life. I did say that Hickington didn't really like Pocklington, and so it might be that we could dismiss what he said about having to tiptoe through the marketplace, except there is another contemporary description of the place, and that comes from Sir James Pennington. The Penningtons being Wilberforce's big friends. He was a local GP, and he wrote to one of his fellow magistrates a little bit about Pocklington.
Sir James Pennington, JP, in 1780. The abominable practices in Pocklington, which prevail in almost every public house, of carding, cocking, and every species of gambling. The alehouse, kept by a certain Pemberton Scaife, should be suppressed. It is one of the most notorious, disorderly, bawdy houses, and a nuisance to the whole country.
That wasn't necessarily that bad a thing for William Wilberforce. Like I say, he'd been brought here by his grandfather and his mother, sent to Pocklington. His grandfather said if he maintained his evangelical views, he would disinherit him. And that was a fairly big thing, because the Wilberforces were quite wealthy merchants that shipped iron across the Baltic Sea. There'll be many of you here in the audience who are parents who have steered your offspring away from wine, women and song. Well, Wilberforce's mother decided to open his eyes a little bit, and she took him round house parties, introducing him to eligible young ladies, and he was a very good singer, and so he became very popular, entertaining at the end of the evening. And so he had quite what would be called in those days a gay life for several years. But he did maintain that serious side to his perspective and we talked about the biographies. In the raffle, there's a copy of quite a good biography by William Hague, the former Home Secretary. And he is one of the people who did say he could see in Wilberforce's writings how many of his later views were formed while he was here and studying in Pocklington. Although when I say studying, he never did an essay until the very last minute. And it was similar when he went to Cambridge. His contemporaries at Cambridge said he skipped many essays, but he was very popular because whenever you went to his rooms, there was a great Yorkshire pie that you could help yourself to a slice of, and he would always sing and entertain people. Maybe I should have gone to Cambridge, no lectures, lots of pie and a bit of singing. So he had a very rounded teenage years. But again, looking at various biographies, there was a dispute, and particularly in the first half of the 19th century, there was a clash between whether Thomas Clarkson or William Wilberforce were the original inspiration of the anti-slavery movement. And one of the things that happened is after Wilberforce died, various of his contemporaries wrote to his sons about their reminiscences of him. And one of those, Tyndall Walmsley, was at school with Wilberforce, and he wrote about how William Wilberforce gave him a letter to post because he lived in the town, whereas Wilberforce lived in the school, and so he passed the post office on his way home, in between all the piles that Jeff described. The post office in those days is what is now Woody's restaurant, what many people would know as NatWest Bank. And Tyndall Walmsley wrote about how he was given this letter, and I'll ask Jake to read the description of what he said.
His abomination of the slave trade he evinced when he was not more than 14 years of age. He boarded in the master's house where boys were kept within bounds. I lived in the village. One day he gave me a letter to put in the post office, addressed to the editor of the York paper, which he told me was in condemnation of the odious traffic in human flesh.
That's a pretty dramatic statement for a 14-year-old. Odious traffic in human flesh. A number of people have said because they have never found that letter being published, that therefore it didn't exist and it was made up by Wilberforce's sons in order to bring him to the top of the tree of the anti-slavery movement. You can make your own mind up that in addition to those words being read by a distinguished clergyman, Tyndall Walmsley, the school friend who said he posted it, became the Reverend Tyndall Walmsley, who was an Anglican clergyman for 65 years. Not only that, the Archbishop of Canterbury selected him to be the first General Secretary and first school inspector of the National Schools Movement. All the church schools around the country, the National Schools Movement created thousands and thousands of schools across Britain and across the world, including one in Pocklington. The first national schools in Pocklington was where the library is. It had to be knocked down because it was in the way of the railway. You know, the Victorians were less precious about things than possibly we are today with HS2, but that got in the way of the rail line, so it moved on to New Street in the 1850s. But Tyndall Walmsley was a man of impeccable reputation, and so I think it's probably the editor that read Wilberforce's letter and threw it in the bin that we need to blame, rather than point the finger at Robert and Samuel Wilberforce for making the tale up. We'll take a little bit more, and you can make your own mind up, because we have a number of Wilberforce's school essays. And there is one particular one that also indicates some interest in the issues of freedom and people's lack of freedom. And I'm going to ask Henry Hudson, who is tonight, you are William Wilberforce, and so he will read one of Wilberforce's essays.
Excrucior animo quod mihi dome abiendum est. I am utterly distraught because I must leave home. It must be owned by everyone of real judgment that of all other things, travelling is at once the properest to improve the understanding and complete a gentleman's education. It wears off those mean national prejudices which too often take possession of the mind and enables a person to be, in reality, a citizen of the world, not blindly attached to any particular country, but honouring merit wherever it is found, reproving vice through even in his own countrymen. It is most of all conducive to the advantage of a young person, as it enables him to see everything in its proper colours, by not examining any particular set of people, but mankind in general. It gives him a taste for the polite arts and liberal sciences, and what is most necessary of all, by seeing the wonders of the creation, the admirable provision all bountiful providence has made for its creatures, his mind is touched with a sense of his duty to the divine benefactor, and his thoughts raised to the great first cause of all these extraordinary productions of nature. But as all things are corrupted from the original design of their institution, so now a great many travel merely to boast of it, and without gaining anything by it, but matchless impudence and effrontery. Now every person who has run away from debt comes home and talks of foreign countries, and one would hardly think it possible that crossing a strait of 21 miles could give a man such privileges as it generally does. Indeed, such people are too much encouraged, and they always greet their antagonists with, "You will pardon me, you do not know the world so well as I who have travelled." If this is knowledge of the world, may we ever live in ignorance. But the man who travels with a design to improve himself, like the bee wanders from nation to nation and extracts something useful from them all. There is scarce a place, however void of entertainment at first sight, in which he does not learn something new, and does not only travel to see the rich, the opulent cities, but to contemplate the wonders of nature. In short, his design is not so much to make himself a fine gentleman in the general acceptation of the word, as to be a useful member of society and a friend to all mankind. Travelling enlarges all his views and polishes and gives a finishing stroke to his education and manners. He does not only go into those countries which it is fashionable to see, or where everything is convenient. No, he braves the greatest dangers. he undergoes the greatest difficulties to examine whatever is extraordinary or uncommon. He joins the Spanish principle of honour, divested of all their barbarity, to the French politesse, whose levity he tempers by the English bluntness and honesty. To these he joins the industry of the Dutch and the solidity of the Germans. In short, he culls, with care, whatever is excellent from every country, whatever is useful, whatever is accomplishing. He observes with pleasure a savage nation emerging from barbarity, and the different steps it takes to politeness and the knowledge of the arts and sciences. When he travels into a country seeming almost forgot and neglected by nature, how is he delighted to find that even on these rugged, these uncouth, barren mountains, the inhabitants are happy, superlatively happy from the enjoyment of their liberty, that this divine comforter spreads a smile over every face and makes the whole have an air of cheerfulness and content. How is he shocked by viewing one part of the world seeming made only to furnish slaves for the other? He will take pleasure in seeing the struggles a free people make for their liberty, in viewing those countries where never inhabitant entered, in beholding them in their native beauty, unadorned by art and smiling with all the gay luxuriance of nature. The fatal calamities of the Americas will warn him against pride and covetousness. The sad effects of vice in other countries will put him into extirpating it in his own. And after observing the dreadful consequences of oppression and tyranny, he will bless his Creator for placing him in a land of freedom, affluence, and plenty. Since such are the benefits, such the advantages of travelling, let me advise all those who have opportunity to go into foreign countries, as it brightens the understanding and wears off that rust which naturally adheres to most people who spend their lives amongst one set of people. Not that I would have him only take a trip into Italy, for in which people generally travel deserves no other name. There view old rusty coins, defaced statues and worm-eaten pictures. No, I am for noble pursuits. Let him examine the manners, the customs and good qualities of the nations he passes through, and at last come home an honour to himself, to his friends and to his country. William Wilberforce, May 1774.
I think I would have been fairly stunned if one of my 14-year-old sons had have written an essay of that standard. But again, if I just repeat just 2 lines out of that, how is he shocked by viewing one part of the world seemingly made only to furnish slaves for the other? And yet a number of people challenged the view that Wilberforce only became interested in the anti-slavery movement later in life. It's very clear that he was pulling together some very strong views on liberty and on how the world should be. It's also interesting that his teacher must have got a bit of a surprise when they set an essay question of, "I am utterly distraught because I must leave home," and that was what Wilberforce produced. Thank you. I think I know a bit about Wilberforce. I think I know a bit about Wilberforce, and I think he would have enjoyed that. So thank you very much again. It is an important part of this evening. This wasn't in All Saints when Wilberforce spent his time here, but it's a symbol he will have known very well, because an eagle is the Wilberforce family coat of arms. And for anybody who doesn't know about the Wilberforce and Wilberforces, in the 1560s, an earlier William Wilberforce lived at Wilberforce, up the road, where his family had been the main honchos for round about 300 or 400 years. And the William Wilberforce of the 1560s had two families. His first wife died before him, and he married again. His first family, his eldest son, remained in Wilberforce and retained the Wilberforce with two S's name, and William Senior moved out to Beverley, where his second wife was from and was something of an heiress, and so he had a second family, and they adapted the name Wilberforce, ORCE, and so you ended up with two branches of the same family. But the eagle is the Wilberforce family coat of arms, and an eagle such as this is also the badge of St John's College at Cambridge, where he went to from Pocklington, and it's also one of the badges of Pocklington School, and it also appears on the coat of arms of the East Riding of Yorkshire and on the coat of arms of the town of Pocklington. So we couldn't not hump it from that corner down to the front. I've said that Wilberforce spent many happy times here in the church in Pocklington. His mother might have discouraged him from being a devout Christian, and he actually became an MP just a couple of weeks after his 21st birthday. So he was very young when he went into the House. He didn't do a lot. He was always an independent. He didn't join the Tory or the Whig parties. He always wanted to be his own man, and that was why he turned down several offers to join one party or the other and to become a member of the cabinet or to go into the House of Lords. But in his first 4 years in Parliament, he did a bit, but he also played a lot of roulette and spent quite a lot of time in gentlemen's clubs. But then he was reborn as a Christian, and he went back to those evangelical roots of his childhood. But what we're going to do now is go back to my old friend William Hickington, who will tell us a little bit about the church of Pocklington and the town of Pocklington. In 1770, just before Wilberforce came here, the Dean of York did a visitation when he inspected the church, and Jake Belder is going to be promoted this evening from Vicar of Pocklington to Dean of York. And on this side, and Sheena McNamee, who is the External Relations Director at Pocklington School, is going to respond to the Dean's questioning on behalf of the congregation. And so I will pass you over to the Dean and the people.
Is your church in good repair? Is its chancel neat and fair? Are its pews well cleaned and matted? Doth your vicar e'er come at it? Or when absent doth provide one to be your ghostly guide? Is your curate grave or mellow? Is he, sirs, a worthy fellow? Doth he read the prayers and preach in a manner fit to teach? Is a stipend to him given in proportion to the living?
Our church, good sir, is in good plight. Our chancel, too, is neat and tight. The pews are all kept neat and clean, as you could wish, good Mr. Dean. Our vicar is a wealthy man and preaches seldom as he can. It's true indeed, he does provide one to be our ghostly guide, who seldom fails to spout on Sunday and rarely to get drunk on Monday. The prayers he reads out, round and full, though rather too much like a bull. Yet in his pulpit some adore him and think there's none to go before him. His salary, indeed, we fear, is scarcely £30 a year, which, as the living is 60, some think should be a little more.
Pray, have you got a parish clerk, whose age at least doth reach the mark? He ought, you know, to be a score. Then tell me, is he less or more? And answer truly as you can, is he good, sirs, an honest man? And are his wages duly paid? And does your sexton mind his trade, and slyly fetch a gentle rap to those he catches in a nap?
A parish clerk, sir, we have got. A saucy, proud, assuming Scot, full old enough to fill his place, had he one single grain of grace. But then he's such a favourite grown, he huffs and hectors half the town. His wage he gets, but with some trouble, because he often asks for double. The sexton is a sober blade. He minds his bells and broom and spade, and all things doth keep in order, except when he himself's asleep.
Well, so much for the sons of the steeple. Next, let's inquire about the people. Do your parishioners before him still set a manner of decorum? Or during service talk of news? Or do they wrangle for their pews?
Oh, there are few graver congregations. We seldom talk about but fashion.
Pray, are there in your town no sectaries? Or are there none who sell electaries?
Of Methodists we have a few, and their tabernacle new, where Billy Fugle takes large pains to turn his honest hearers' brains. With whom the knave so well succeeds, he gets as much to serve his needs, and rides about in manner pompous, mounted on high-fed Rocinantus.
Pray, have you in your town no drunkards, who use their Bibles less than tankards? And do your landlords let them stay, and tipple while they ought to pray?
We have indeed some jolly souls who love to meet o'er friendly bowls, who'll sit from Saturday at noonday, till cock proclaims approach of Sunday, but seldom lengthen out their potion until the hour comes of devotion.
Pray, are there any with respect to wenching you did ere detect? Or are there any cuckold makers among your butchers, brewers, bakers?
Fornifiers, fornicators, no, we're clear of all such creatures.
Come, come, I find you pretty well. So, Master Sexton, ring the bell, and let us pray for each poor sinner. And then my boys will go for dinner.
That's Hickington being a little bit livelier than he was earlier. We're coming towards the end of the evening, and when Wilberforce first came to Pocklington, he wasn't happy. He would much rather have stayed with his aunt and uncle at Wimbledon, and in actual fact at the back there is one of his letters that he kept sending letters back to his aunt in Wimbledon in secret. He gave them to other people to post them so that his mother and grandfather wouldn't find out about that. But he came to love this place, and while he wasn't happy to come here, he was very unhappy to leave and helped. And what we're going to do is finish off with the man himself. I'd said how Wilberforce was unhappy to leave Pocklington, and I said earlier that some people disparaged the fact that he wrote a letter to a newspaper and it can't have existed because it didn't appear. But what we do know did appear in a newspaper some years later was his description of leaving Pocklington for the last time. He did come back later in adulthood. He used to have his summer holidays in the Lake District, and on at least one occasion he made a detour round by Pocklington and went to dinner with his old headmaster, and he spoke about how much he enjoyed seeing old familiar scenes. But when he left the school for the last time, he wrote about how he got the stagecoach to Hull and he stood on top of the coach looking backwards with tears in his eyes and seeing the church tower going further and further away into the distance until he got nearly to Market Wheaton and couldn't see Pocklington Church Tower any longer. And he did actually compose a very short poem about that leaving Pocklington experience. And I'll ask our tonight William Wilberforce to read his poem.
Sweet scene of my youth, seat of friendship and truth, where love chased each fast fleeting year, loth to leave thee I mourned. For a last look I turned, but thy tower was scare, seen through a tear. William Wilberforce, summer 1776.
As I said, we'll leave the very last words to Wilberforce, and while tonight the focus hasn't particularly been about his later achievements, we wouldn't be here if he wasn't the person who brought forward and led the abolition of slavery movement, and how he managed to bring that to fruition just a brief period before he died. We're going to hear from Wilberforce's own speech to Parliament in 1789. He proposed an abolition bill. He had to propose an abolition bill another 9 times before he actually managed to get it through Parliament. And this 1789 speech, a few months earlier, he'd been seriously ill and his doctor gave him 2 weeks to live. Tonight, we're going to hear some extracts. The original speech without notes was for 3.5 hours. You don't have to worry, we've cut it down a bit. And I'm going to ask Martin Davies, who's the deputy head at Pocklington School, to read that. Originally, Toby Seth, the headmaster, was going to read this, but he got called away at short notice, and so Martin had to step into the breach. This speech has been also called the greatest speech in history. And one of Wilberforce's fellow MPs wrote afterwards that he watched a shrimp stand up and turn into a whale. So no pressure there, Martin.
May the 12th, 1789. When I consider the magnitude of the subject which I am to bring before the House, a subject in which the interests not of this country nor of Europe alone, but of the whole world and of posterity are involved, and when I think at the same time on the weakness of the advocate who has undertaken this great cause, when these reflections press upon my mind, it is impossible for me not to feel both terrified and concerned at my own inadequacy to such a task. But when I reflect, however, on the encouragement which I have had through the whole course of a long and laborious examination of this question, and how much candour I have experienced, and how conviction has increased within my own mind, when I reflect especially that, however averse any gentleman may now be, yet we shall all be of one opinion in the end. When I turn myself to these thoughts, I courage. I determine to forget all my other fears, and I march forward with a firmer step in the full assurance that my cause will bear me out, and that I shall be able to justify upon the clearest principles every resolution in my hand, the avowed end of which is the total abolition of the slave trade. I mean not to accuse anyone, but to take the shame upon myself, in common indeed with the whole Parliament of Great Britain, for having suffered this horrid trade to be carried on under their authority. We are all guilty. We ought all to plead guilty, and not to exculpate ourselves by throwing the blame on others, and I therefore deprecate every kind of reflection against the various descriptions of people who are more immediately involved in this wretched business. What must make every man of feeling shudder was that after examining the annals of Africa, numbers had been carried every year from their native country in order to satiate the avarice of a certain description of men whose whole thoughts were bent upon tyranny and oppression. When first I heard, sir, of these iniquities, I considered them as exaggerations and could not believe it possible that men had determined to live by exerting themselves for the torture and misery of their fellow creatures. I have taken great pains to make myself master of the subject and can declare that such scenes of barbarity are enough to rouse the indignation and horror of the most callous of mankind. So much misery is condensed in so little room, is more than the human imagination has ever before conceived. Wherever the sun shines, let us go round the world with him, diffusing our benefices, but let us not traffic, only that we may set kings against their subjects, subjects against their kings, setting millions of our fellow creatures a-hunting each other for slaves, creating fairs and markets for human flesh. As soon as ever I had arrived thus far in my investigation of the slave trade, I confess to you, sir, so enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did its wickedness appear, that my own mind was completely made up for the abolition. A trade founded in iniquity and carried on as this was must be abolished. Let the policy be what it might. Let the consequences be what they would. I from this time determined that I would never rest till I had effected its abolition.
If anybody's got any ideas what we can do in 5 years' time to commemorate William Wilberforce leaving Pocklington, let me know. But for this evening, thank you very much to the celebration singers. Thank you to Jake and Jeff and Henry, Sheena and Martin. And thank you to William Wilberforce.